In this video, I want to review a short cross country I did several weeks ago. I had originally planned to launch early in the morning from South Mountain around 10 a.m. The wind at South Mountain was scheduled to switch from south to north, and my plan was to hang around the air until the wind shifted, then push south. I had 5 waypoints planned in my mapping app, and my goal was to fly to a spot just south of Casa Grande. As is often the case when I'm flying, things didn't go as planned. Okay, the wind was fine at launch, but there was little to no thermal activity, at least where I was looking. There are probably a few reasons for the lack of thermals. First, it was still pretty early in the day, but the wind was also shifting from the south to the east, and I wasn't in the best place given these conditions. Nonetheless, you see, I pushed out away from the mountain and tried to find some activity over the landing, but I ended up landing within 10 to 15 minutes of launch. Really wasn't much of a flight. Fortunately, it was still early and I decided to stick with my original plan. I hiked from the south landing to the north launch, and within 10 minutes of arriving on launch, the thermals started picking up from the north. This is one of those times when the south launch was still registering a light southerly wind, while conditions were also launchable from the north. This sometimes makes for a bumpy ride, but it didn't take too much time to find a strong thermal. I was able to cross over to the south side, and on the south side of the mountain, I found some good lift there, and then I was off. The first obstacle you need to overcome when flying south from South Mountain is to fly the gap between South Mountain and the 202 freeway. This is only 4.5 to 6 kilometers, depending on where you decide to cross. But you need to consider that airspace starts at around 1,500 meters. You probably want to have around 700 meters of altitude when you cross the freeway to give you time to catch another thermal. You also have to keep in mind that you don't want to get too close to the transmission lines or the road. It'd just be a bad place to have an emergency, have to pull your reserve. So averaging those out those numbers, you need a glide ratio of around 8 to make the jump without topping up. So you're probably going to need to top up on the way. So fortunately, there are a lot of terrain features along the way that produce consistent thermals. You've probably noticed that I started pushing south while I was pretty low. Found a lifty line and decided to push forward, or more accurately to the south. But this ends up biting me later. As you can see here, I flew over the rock outcrop just east of Kyron School. This spot is sometimes a good thermal trigger, but not on this day and not with a northerly wind. I ended up getting really low, and for safety, I flew back to Kyron School to try to catch a thermal that had flown over previously. I ended up working a very weak thermal over the school, literally fighting for meters. I really thought my flight was over at this point. In fact, at one point, I was preparing myself to land at the school, but I was able to pull a little bit of extra lift and get back over the landing at South Mountain. By the time I made it back to South Mountain, it was around 12:30, and then the thermal activity was starting to heat up a bit. And I got a lucky break when I was coming in for landing. I caught a really strong thermal just north of the landing, and that thermal ended up taking me from around 600 meters all the way up to 1,300 meters, where I decided I was high enough to try a crossing again. It was a huge sense of relief to get some altitude again, especially after you think that you're coming in to land. I turned off my camera here and I don't remember exactly where I was able to gain some altitude, but I think it was over the driving range at the Foothills Golf Club. There are a few small hills in that area too that are generally pretty good for finding lift. From there, I was able to get to my first waypoint along the 202 near Pecos Storage. I generally find that I can fly from this area east to Pecos Park along the 202 and not lose any altitude. Not sure if it's the bare fields or the 202 itself, but this line is generally pretty lifty. Flying east adds to your route versus flying directly over the reservation south of the 202. But I think there are some benefits to staying close to the main roadway. In the case, it's the 347 to Maricopa. Also, you don't want to land on the reservation. That wouldn't be a good thing to do. But I've also found that the Wild Horse Pass Golf Club is a great place to top up on altitude before you actually head south. And the 347 is wide enough that it does seem to produce rising air. So you can, generally I was flying along that and not losing too much lift. But this was my first time going south away from the mountains, so I can't say that for sure. It could have just been that day. At this point, you're out of the city and you can focus more of your attention on flying efficiently and navigating to your next waypoint. You also get more breathing room with respect to airspace. Once you pass south of the casino, racetrack area, airspace limits for Class B airspace surrounding the airport go up to 6,000 feet. It's not much, but it makes a difference when you're trying to go far. As you fly south, one of the things that you want to keep an eye out for is small aircraft. As I was flying, I saw at least 3 small airplanes fly below me. They're likely skirting around the Class B airspace to the west. I generally follow the 347 highway, but there's some farms along the route that seem to be producing a lot of rising air too. So you want to constantly checking, making sure that you're in a lifty line. So I flew most of this section on speed bar. In no time I was approaching my third waypoint, the small hill just to the north of Maricopa. On screen, as I approached this hill, I briefly registered 9 meters per second of sink, which was pretty jarring. I flew through that sink and quickly I was jarred in the opposite direction as I approached the hill and hit 6 meters per second of lift. So really a lot of turbulence from the rising and falling air in that area. Note that this hill marks the edge of Phoenix Airport airspace. And south of this location, you'll not have to worry about height restrictions, at least from the airport. This hill is a great place to climb, and my advice is to take advantage of it, to climb as high as you can. This will prevent you from having to top up in the weaker thermals later. I only climbed to 2,500 meters, and I think this hurt me later, prevented me from making my next waypoint. From this point, it's not further to make it to Maricopa, and the city is already visible in the distance. I did have to gain some altitude over a field, but I'd say you should aim at flying from the hill where I just climbed directly to the city on speed bar. Once I got to the city, I found the calmest flying of my day, flying along the edge of the city. Flew a few kilometers losing minimal altitude, and was getting confident that I was going to achieve my goal. I'd originally planned to avoid Maricopa and flying towards the I-10, but conditions seemed good enough to justify heading directly south. I was headed for the Maricopa-Casa Grande highway when I ended up hitting some moderate sink. Instead of continuing onto the highway, I took a deviation east to a subdivision under construction just east of Maricopa. I noted the graded fields being prepared to build houses, and I thought that I could catch another thermal either there or over the adjacent houses. Unfortunately, this decision ended up ending my day. As I crossed several fields in subdivision, I only hit light lift when I passed over a church just before landing. Fortunately, I ended up landing less than a mile from a friend's house, unbeknownst to me at the time. So in the end, everything worked out despite my landing short. So in the end, my flight was around 42 kilometers, took roughly 2 hours. My pace was pretty slow, but I lost a lot of time at the beginning of my flight, getting low and having to retreat back to South Mountain. Flying over the desert is much different from flying in the mountains, and I hope this video helps people who are just getting started doing longer cross-country flights.